everyone. Welcome to the Barnes& Noble Midday Mystery event. I'm Stephanie Wrobel. I'm going to be your moderator for today. I am a thriller writer of novels like Darling Rose Gold and This Might Hurt, and my third book is called The Hitchcock Hotel and will be coming out on September 24th. And now I'd like to introduce you to my friend Caitlin Mullen, who we're here to discuss today. Caitlin earned a BA in English and Creative Writing from Colgate University, an MA in English from NYU, and an MFA in Fiction from Stony Brook University. While at Stony Brook, she taught undergraduate creative writing, served as an editor and contributing writer for the Southampton Review, and worked as a bookseller at Word in Brooklyn. Please see us is her Edgar-Award winning debut novel, which I am so excited to talk to her about today. Ask her all of my questions and lots of yours. And speaking of, if you haven't gotten a chance to submit a question yet, go ahead and drop it in the Q&A, and I will try to get to it by the end of our chat today. So without further ado, Caitlin, welcome.
Hi, Stephanie. I'm so excited we get to chat today. This is so fun.
Yeah, so I want to start out with, for anybody who hasn't gotten a chance to read the book, just give us a brief, preview of what it's about.
Sure. Please See Us is set in Atlantic City over the course of a single summer. It's centered on two main characters. The first is Clara, who's a recent high school dropout working as a boardwalk psychic and trying to make ends meet. Second is Lily, who is a 20-something who has moved back home to the Atlantic City area after a major personal and professional fallout in New York City. She's working as a receptionist at a spa in a casino. She and Clara meet and form an unlikely alliance as they both realize women are starting to go missing in and around Atlantic City. Clara starts to have some disturbing visions that she thinks might be related to these disappearances. So the two of them band together and try to figure out what's happening to these women and see if they might help prevent the next disappearance in Atlantic City as things start to get closer to home and more dire for them.
And so I wanted to start out by, we've talked in the past, full disclosure, Caitlin and I are friends, so we've talked a lot about our books and writing and stuff like that. We talked in the past and discovered that both of us, our debut novels were our MFA theses, and I'm curious what the timing was for you. Did you go into the program with this idea, or was it like, I need to write a thesis and then came up with it? Or what was the how did that interact with your MFA program?
Yeah, so I came into my MFA having only written short fiction, really. I had maybe one attempt at a novel that had sort of stalled out around, 60 or 80 pages, but no serious draft under my belt when I started my graduate program. So I started writing a novel that was set on the Jersey Shore that was not Please See Us. It was quite different. And that took up most of my first year of the program. And it soon became clear to me that that novel wasn't really working. So the summer between my first and second year in graduate school, I had the idea for Please See Us, which was inspired by real life events. And I said I was going to give myself the summer to try to work on this draft and take a break from the other book. And so what became Please See Us sort of ended up just taking over as the dominant draft in that situation. And I continued to work on it, and it became my MFA thesis that fall, sort of in an official capacity, once I signed on with an advisor and started to work with them in earnest.
Okay. And I'm curious, so two things that really stand out about the book are the setting of Atlantic City. So why did you choose there? Why it's so beautifully portrayed, just like the grime, and you just really feel like you're there. I don't think I've ever been to Atlantic City, but I felt like I had been by the end of it. So I'm curious how you wound up setting the book there. And then also, you really focus in on an often overlooked group of people, which is sex workers. And, the plight that they go through and how they end up getting victimized. And a lot of times that's not really the focus of these kinds of stories. So I want to know how you, ended up with those two, that setting and sort of this group of people.
Yeah. So as I said, the novel was inspired by real life events. In 2006, the bodies of 4 sex workers were found behind a motel on the outskirts of Atlantic City in the marsh. And that crime was never solved. It's remained unsolved to this day. So I grew up in the area. My family has been in Atlantic City in South Jersey for a long time. My dad worked in Atlantic City. My grandmother worked in Atlantic City. So we sort of have a strong footprint there. So something like that happening close to where you grow up at that particular age, I think it was 18 or 19, that felt to me very jarring. It felt to me like a sort of referendum of sorts about like what can happen to women in the world who, maybe live on the margins of society, so to speak, or who experience precarity in that way. So I wanted to write the book in a way that was focused on the experiences of those women. It wasn't maybe as interesting to me to write from the perspective of, say, a police investigator and I didn't want to center the murderer in the book. It was really always more about the women and their lives and what they cared about. I wanted it to feel like a thriller and mystery, but one that was deeply humane toward its victims while providing that kind of story and working with those frameworks. So yeah, as far as the Atlantic City setting, as I said, my family worked there. I spent summers off from college working in Atlantic City, which actually inspired my character Lily's job. I was also a receptionist at a casino spa. So, I didn't know I was gathering material at that point, but a lot of those experiences ended up sort of fueling those scenes in the novel.
Yeah. Okay. And, you touched on something which I think is a real standout point of your novel, which is that it's really not about the killer, I don't want to give anything away or get too far into it, but I wondered whether, you really bring the victims and survivors to kind of the forefront. And I'm curious, throughout the process, from professors, agents, editors, did you ever get any pushback on that? Did anyone ever say, like, we need to see more of, X?
I didn't have any pushback from professors. I did have a couple of close readers who at one point were like, what would it be like to write from the perspective of the killer? And I was like at such a loss to do that when I tried, because I don't know, in a lot of ways, I feel like we've heard those stories before. And so anything I wrote felt both like flat because my interest just wasn't there, and also derivative of the kind of stories we hear. Right there are like types that people write about when it comes to the people who perpetrate violence. So I did get a little pushback there. Luckily, in terms of my publishing team and my agent, everyone was really sort of on board with the vision of the book and saw what I was trying to do and what was important to me in the book. So I was very lucky in that sense that they valued the book for what it was trying to do when it came time to publish it and get it out in the world.
And I think that's one of its selling points. That's what makes it so unique, because it's clearly very intentional, right? That it's like, this is usually, the salacious bits are usually what are the headline or the selling point or whatever. And that's what makes this such a unique thriller, is that it doesn't do that. Speaking of points of view, you mentioned the other day that originally this book started out as one. I'm curious, was that Clara, or who did you start with, and how did you expand to, I think at last count, it was maybe 5, including the Janes, like 5 points of view?
Yeah, so it started out as one point of view. It started out all in Lily's point of view, who's the 20-something character who works at the spa. And it was all from Lily's points of view as she was sort of like retreating back home to Atlantic City from New York and licking her wounds from her breakup and her professional failures. And it was, she knew Clara, they interacted. And I think maybe that was easier for me for a first draft, because in a way, Lily and I are probably the most on the surface alike, similar background, college for the arts, working in New York City, sort of a striving 20-something. That story felt familiar to me. And then after that draft, I felt like it needed more dimension. And that's when Clara's point of view came in. So then the second draft was just 2 points of view. It was Lily and Clara. And that gave the book another angle. It was really hard for me to write Claire's point of view and get that point of view down. So that took a lot of work. She was probably the hardest part of the book to write. I think it was really hard for me to figure out, she's a psychic, but she's also sort of conning people sometimes. She resorts to like petty theft in order to make ends meet. She, though, is also genuinely smart and resourceful. She is vulnerable, but she's also street savvy. So like balancing all these opposing characteristics and that she contained and making that voice feel appropriate to her age. She's a teenager and getting that down. Also her visions, for a long time, I wanted her to she didn't have any kind of real psychic power in the first draft. She was sort of getting by on her wits and, reading tarot cards, but she didn't experience visions the way she does in the final draft of the novel. So I wanted to give her some kind of power in a very real sense, which is interesting because her visions both make her vulnerable and empower her in some ways. So it's a double-edged sword. But I wanted her, she felt like too vulnerable in the first few drafts. So I wanted to give her a sort of leg up of sorts and being able to have these glimpses into what was going on around her that other people can't see.
Yeah.
And then it just grew from there. I felt like, a more populated novel in terms of points of view gave a bigger, broader picture of Atlantic City. And as we said, including the victims in the novel and including their voices, these sections told from the points of view of the Jane Doe characters helped get perspective on Atlantic City across a couple of different timelines. People of all sorts of backgrounds who had found their way to Atlantic City, pursuing all sorts of different dreams or fleeing all sorts of different realities at home. And I wanted to paint a portrait of how women, whose stories end the way their stories end, how rich and vivid and full their lives also are, even though our tendency is to reduce them to victims in the media and sometimes in stories like these.
Yeah. I have to say, as, just especially from a writer's perspective, I found like the Jane's perspective, like every time I was like, ooh, good, another one. It was just so beautifully written. And I love like the Greek chorus aspect of like, them kind of seeing over the proceedings and, being in the story, but not, you know what I mean? I'm curious if you had a favorite perspective to write and if you generally find yourself, if during the process of writing you have a different favorite versus when you like then are finished with the process, does that favorite perspective change?
That's interesting. I would say the Janes was my favorite to write, even though some of their stories are, painful and difficult. Whenever I sat down, once I decided I was going to incorporate them into the novel, it felt like whenever I sat down to write those sections, I knew what I had to say, which is a very rare experience in writing a novel. Those sections required the least amount of revision and editing. It just felt like I understood their place in the book. So when I was writing, I really liked writing those stories. And I think it helped me understand the why of the book. Like, why am I telling this story and why is it important? And it was in part to be a tribute to the experiences of those women. Looking back, I do think Clara feels like a favorite point of view because maybe it was so difficult for me to figure her out. I think I look back and I'm like, okay, I got there. It was so hard along the way to really arrive at her voice and at her sort of plot points and figure out what was going to happen to her over the course of the novel. So that now when I look back, I'm like, oh, okay, like this, I'm glad I fought through that to create the Clara that exists in the book.
Yeah, I have the same experience with my own is like the ones who are the easiest are always like the favorites during the process because there's so much you're already juggling that it's just like, oh, thank God someone that comes along and like makes your life a little easier. But then in some ways, yeah, the one that was the biggest struggle, but you feel like you finally got them, like those end up being the ones that you're almost like proudest of in a way.
Exactly.
Did you find, I actually find it more difficult, I think, which it sounds like is the opposite of your experience. I find writing the kind of like straight man or the character that's most like me to be the hardest because I always feel like they're so boring. But it sounds like Lily was like which maybe is counterintuitive because like Lily is the closest to your lived experience. So of course, like that would naturally, you can lean on kind of what you know more versus research. But did you ever struggle to feel like keep interest in her or no?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, I think like she was my starting off point because it was like, well, I've never written a novel before. Let's take it a little easy on myself and start with this point of view character who does share some characteristics and like some worldview things that are similar to me. But yeah, then there is that struggle of like, okay, well, how was she unlike me? How do I challenge myself here? How do I, differentiate her worldview so that she's a character and not just like a representation of myself on the page? Because I don't, my life is not that interesting. Like, so, and, I wanted her to be fully a fiction, even if some of her experiences are inspired by my experiences. So yeah, I feel like that was also one of the struggles from like early draft to early draft was like, what can also happen to Lily that will be different or challenging than, existed in the first draft.
Yeah. So where did you find yourself most needing to do research or to fill in gaps of knowledge?
Because I had like lived around Atlantic City and worked there, I did have like a pretty strong basis in place. Like I didn't necessarily have to like go to Atlantic City and do a ton of research because I was, working from what I knew and experienced and all those like sensory details that had been so vivid to me throughout all those years. One of the subplots of the novel is that Lily, whose background is in art history and who, before coming back to Atlantic City, had worked in an art gallery. She finds this trove of unsigned paintings, and the paintings are historical scenes of Atlantic City. So that's where I did a lot of research and that was really like pleasurable research because I knew a lot about Atlantic City's history, but like to go through archives of photos online and look at historical scenes of Atlantic City and say like, okay, what would this painter have painted from Atlantic City's past? And there's all sorts of like fascinating bits of history from Atlantic City that, surface through these paintings. And that was also important for me to incorporate in the novel. Because I think Atlantic City is like a fascinating place that has had so many different identities over the years, decade from decade from decade. It's shifted and changed so much. So being able to represent that in the novel and do research on that history was really fun. I also did research on tarot because I don't have a background in like tarot card reading. And so for Clara, my boardwalk psychic character, she gives tarot readings to some of the other characters in the book. So I got a deck of tarot cards and I would like practice doing tarot spreads on my living room table. And I did an experiment where for every time Clara gave someone a reading in the novel, I would pull 3 cards, and those would be the cards I would have to use in the scene in the book. And every time they worked out like beautifully with, the situation, really? The character facing. So all of those, anytime Clara pulls tarot cards in the novel, those are cards I actually, took out of my deck and pulled on my table and just incorporated them into the scene. So yeah, doing research on
writing challenge.
Yeah. So like there are fun research elements like that. And yeah, so, there were times when I'm sure my husband thought I was crazy because he would come home and I'd have tarot cards like, and papers.
The tarot's guiding the book.
Yeah. Little side hustle to supplement the writing.
Yeah, if this doesn't work out, I can hit the boardwalk. So I'm curious then, how much did you know ahead of time? Are you an outliner, plotter, pantser? What's your it's interesting to me how the tarot card readings, like, was it already a pretty loose thing that you were kind of letting guide you, or was it like everything else was pretty structured and this was just like the one area where you were playing? Or
I am very much a pantser. I am not a plotter. I wish I was in a lot of cases because I feel like that would make my life a lot easier. I don't know a lot about plot going into any project. I think sense of place is important. Like that's where, this novel originated, and some sort of situation that's just snagged in my head. And for instance, in this case, it was these murders and this idea that Atlantic City was this vivid and interesting and varied place that I really wanted to write about. Other than that, I knew very little about the plot going in. And I've just finished a draft of a second book, and that process was very much the same. Just working my way, grasping from draft to draft and figuring it out as I go. So yeah, that's how I work, for better or for worse. Not the most efficient process, but sort of the way I've found I can get things done.
And okay, before we get on to reader questions, what can you tell us about that new book that you just finished a draft of?
It is also set in New Jersey. This time it's set in the New Jersey Pine Barrens, which is another fascinating and I think potentially overlooked place in New Jersey. It's where the myth of the Jersey Devil began. And there's all sorts of fascinating history that I've been researching. So it's very atmospheric, full of, brimming with mythology and sort of strange stories. And it's another story that was inspired by real life events that I've then sort of taken from that source and spun into, total fiction. But it's,
I speak for everyone here when I say we can't wait to read it. So looking forward to that. Okay, we're going to transition to some reader questions. I'll try to do a mix of people who submitted stuff ahead of time and people asking questions in the Q&A chat. The first one, we've kind of started to talk a little bit about, the tarot card readings and Clara's character, but Dawn asked, what approaches do you take to blend the supernatural with the real?
I love that question because, it was hard to find the right balance. I wanted there to be this mystical aspect to the book. I wanted Clara to have something special about her that helped her navigate her particularly difficult circumstances. But I also wanted her to receive, the visions she sees are not complete. They're not, necessarily narrative. They're just little glimpses into scenarios that can't come to her in any other kind of way. And so she's tasked with interpreting them. So I think there's two reasons for that. One is, plot wise, it gives her something to do throughout the pages of the book. I think I realized once I started tinkering with this idea that she might have some sort of slightly supernatural ability that it should be sort of flawed or impartial in order to give her the project of having to figure out what they mean throughout the course of the novel. And then also just to keep the book sort of wholly planted in the real world and, not sort of moved over to the realm of speculative fiction. I still thought, I was mostly working in the conventions of the mystery thriller crime genre and mostly wanted to keep it that way while also playing with that supernatural stuff a little bit.
Yeah, cool. Okay, Lori wants to know, how do you pace yourself while writing a new novel? What does your writing schedule typically look like?
Yeah, so it's different with Please Yes than it is now. And Please Yes, I wrote that in graduate school. I was also teaching and working at a bookstore and finishing up my coursework. Ideally, I would work in the mornings, then at least 3 days a week, although, of course, life tends to get in the way. Now I have 2 young children, so, mornings often involve feeding them and getting them out the door. But I do tend to still like to work earlier in the day when I feel like fresher. If I'm first starting a book, I will try to hit a word count goal with earlier drafts. Typically that's 1,000 to 2,000 words a day, just to get myself to the other side of that draft. And then that shifts as I move into like a revision and editing phase. But I typically try to work on fiction in the first half of the day. And then, the second half of, the afternoon might be reading or cooking or whatever I have to do, house-wise, home life-wise. It's my life certainly doesn't represent like the button chair 9 to 5 kind of life necessarily, but I do try to commit, 4 to 5 days a week to, those mornings and getting some words in a significant way.
And how do you tackle revisions?
Revisions, early revisions, I try to retype the entire book from scratch, which is crazy and really hard. Because I think what helps me about putting it into like a brand new document is I question more about the draft than I would if I were just tinkering in an existing document. And I think it helps me.
Let me get this straight. So this is before you've shared with anyone, right? Or after?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's before I shared.
Write the first thing and then just like kind of with the ethos of like, whatever I remember is the good stuff, whatever I forget was the bad stuff, or what?
Basically, yeah. Which with Please Yes was a draft that I wrote.
I would be starting from scratch and writing a brand new novel. I'd be like, what was the character's name again?
I know. There's like, it's hard. There are good things and bad things about doing that. Obviously, the bad thing is that it's very time consuming and like you might feel like you're like losing things. But I also think it makes room for more surprises at a point in revision in which you might not be as inclined or open to like new things happening. So I think it helps keep me on my toes a little bit in terms of character development and plot and like bigger questions, for a longer period of time before I move into like the more granular revisions on the sentence level, on the scene level, and that kind of thing.
Have you ever looked between first and second draft to see how much changes? Like, do you have an idea roughly? Is it like, 2/3 is brand new, or is it just kind of like roughly the same plot, just told kind of differently? Or what changes do you think are the main ones?
A lot changes, like from first draft to second draft. I mean, I would say like 50% change. I mean, it's hard to put a number to it, but I would say a lot changes. With Police CS in particular, I wrote one draft, and in conversation with my thesis advisor, we decided to lop off the first 75 pages of that draft, just wholesale move them out. So my process does involve a lot of that kind of inefficiency, so to speak. But like I do like to think, and that can be hard, right? And it's hard to feel like you're losing work, but it's also you're making room for what the book's supposed to be. And again, because I'm someone who is not outlining, a lot of that early material isn't meant to be in the final book. It's me feeling my way through a story. So I comfort myself with that.
Yeah, I will say I outlined my first two books and ended up throwing away the entire first draft anyway. So outlining doesn't really guarantee that you're not going to throw stuff away, right? It's just, I think it's more like a security blanket. But yeah, I think sometimes switching up process when you realize like, oh, this actually isn't making me any more efficient. Sometimes you do have to like throw huge chunks away just to like get to the good stuff, right?
Yeah. And it hurts, but you got to do it.
Yeah, as you're throwing it all in the trash. Although I just like leave it. I don't know if you like delete it, or if I leave it in like former draft folders. So it's like, well, it's always there in case I need to revisit it. It feels like,
and I like to look back on it. Yeah. I don't know. I taught a class, like a novel writing class through Catapult, and I actually showed my students some pages from like draft to draft. So that was fun to have those archives to be like, look, you can start here and end up here. It's something radically different. But we could trace, what maybe had changed over 3, 4, 5 drafts. So it's fun to look back on it and see where things evolved.
So, okay, Helen wants to know, it sounds like you don't know how a book is going to end before you start, but how chronological is your writing process? Are you writing in chapter order? It sounds like no. It sounds like you were writing entire POVs and then interweaving them, or how did that work?
So I do try to write the story chronologically when I start a new draft. Because I do think there's an accumulation of like you getting to know the characters, of detail, of plot points. Even if I sort of know where I'm going, I like to see how those things shift subtly and change and build up over the course of a new draft. So I do try to write chronologically. With Please CS, I did write chronologically and then go back and put the Jane character points of view in. That was a little easier because they are less like plot oriented sections, although there is some moving of the plot with those Jane sections, just maybe not in the same way as the Lily and Clara and other narratives. So it was a little easier to do that because it didn't really, I only had to tweak, a few other details in other chapters once I put those Jane chapters in. But yeah, I do try to work chronologically. That is one ordering principle of my mostly otherwise chaotic process.
Okay, and Peter wants to know, so we've kind of talked about the most difficult part of writing the novel, I think, it seems like Clara's chapters. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, totally.
So I think what he's asking, what's the most difficult part of the debut novel journey? So maybe more of like the publishing or like once you finish the writing, like the business side of things, and why was that the most difficult?
Yeah, that's a good question because I mean, on one hand, right, publishing your debut novel represents like a long held dream come true. I do think it's hard to prepare yourself for something that has felt like personal and private for a really long time to be just released widely into the world. And again, on one hand, that's like a wonderful, exciting thing. But I do feel with any piece of writing, whether it's, fiction, nonfiction, whatever it is, there is an inherent sense of vulnerability that comes with publication. Actually, I'd be curious to know, maybe you have thoughts on this. Does it get better the more you publish? That kind of feeling. I think with my debut novel, it was particularly, that was hard.
Yeah, I think I think the older novels, it gets easier. So now with, now that Rose Gold has been out for so long and there's other babies that I'm like more protective of, I think the longer a book has been on the market, the easier it gets because you've kind of seen every criticism that's coming. I will say, and I think we talked about this before, I think avoiding, Goodreads and Amazon to the extent possible and kind of limiting yourself to like reading every single reaction to the book is helpful to one's, ego and kind of the ability to move forward and still want to write new stuff. I think for me, it's always the time right around publication when I feel the most vulnerable about a novel. So I'm sure when the new one comes out in September, but then that's where, like, if you're already into the next one, because, I don't know if viewers, readers know, but from the time you finish a novel, it takes about 9 to 12 months for it to hit bookshelves. So by then you're usually very into the next project, which I also think is helpful. I think then, you've got something else that has caught your eye and your heart, and that helps take away some of the, like, just that like inability to let go of it and lose control of it.
Yeah, you need somewhere else to put all that energy.
Yeah. Okay, Marcia wants to know, what do you do if you have writer's block? And do you believe in writer's block? Because a lot of writers don't.
It's interesting because I do feel like, it's hard to find time to write. So it's like, I don't necessarily have like long stretches of writer's block that get in my way. Maybe on a day-to-day basis, some days it feels a lot harder than others to get words on a page or to figure out what you're doing with a book. And in that case, something I might do is just like free write about what I think is difficult in that particular moment and, see if I can get at something that way. Like, why am I having trouble with this scene? Why am I having trouble with this character? What do I want from this moment in the book? I'll try to like write myself questions and just ask myself open-ended questions about the book and say like, well, what if we saw this from this character's point of view? Or what if this detail, was moved to this chapter? What if this event happened sooner in the novel? What if it happened later? And just sort of pose all these hypotheticals as just a way to like get my gears going and get into the book in some way, even if it's not, that fluency of writing a ton of words in one day.
Yeah.
Or if I'm really having trouble, like I think breaks are important. It's hard to get out of that mentality when you're like, I must push forward, grind it out, keep going. But, I'll take a walk. I will cook something. I'll do something that sort of gets me out into the world or using my hands or something that just gets you in touch with something other than fiction. Because I find that breaks can be really valuable and useful too.
Yeah. And kind of in tandem with that, Jessica asks, what is the best writing advice you have ever received?
It's funny because this isn't advice that I got from anyone who writes fiction. This is something that stuck with me from a college English professor. I was consulting with her on a revision for an academic paper on Shakespeare. And she, leaned into me and just say, you've got your argument. You've got this. This is a good paper. And she was like, you know what? Just show off a little more. And like, I thought that was such fun and unexpected advice. And something that I think can apply to fiction and fiction writing, like not necessarily, you don't want your work to feel pretentious or, self-satisfied, but to like experiment and play and do something maybe a little bit wilder or weirder than you are inclined to do. So I always like keep that little phrase in my mind, like show off a little bit, like, take a risk in some way. And I think that's valuable advice for all kinds of writing.
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm gonna have to add that to my arsenal. Okay.
Right. I kind of want it printed above my desk or something.
Yeah. Although I tend to have the opposite problem. I have literally a Post-it on my desk that says subtlety underlined 3 times because my editor's first round of feedback is always like, let's take it back a few, let's take it down a notch stuff. So I'm probably taking too many shots for the moon, but whatever.
No, it's good to try and then have to like pull it back in and simplify, I feel like.
Yeah. Okay, so Jessica wants to know, can you tell us about what inspired Louise's character?
Yeah, so Louise, he is a janitor who works in the spa where Lily works. He is deaf and mute and has trouble communicating with those around him and is, on the whole, very misunderstood by the people around him. But he is also one of the more perceptive characters in the novel. So to me, like, I think it's interesting to have characters who, I mean, especially in like a resort service atmosphere, like to pay attention to whose stories we're also ignoring. And in this case, you know, in a casino, in a resort, like people don't want to see things being maintained or cleaned. There's all this work that goes into maintaining those kind of spaces that by design is meant to be invisible, unobtrusive. So those people sort of function in the shadows by default anyway. The similar way to me in the way that, like, you know, the women doing sex work sort of existed in the shadows of Atlantic City and of people's understanding. So I think his point of view came out of a desire to explore additional ways that we sort of silence and ignore other kinds of stories and other kinds of people in that atmosphere, in addition to the women who are going missing.
Yeah. I really, I don't want to say too much or give anything away, but I thought that was a really valuable POV ad is all I will say. Yeah. Okay. Jennifer and I share a question here, which she wants to know, was it hard to name the title of your book? And I'm curious if that's always been the title, if you came up with it, if it was like your publisher, and because it's just like the absolute perfect title for this book. And I think titles are so hard to do well. So I'm curious what the origin of that was.
Titles are so hard to do well, and they're so hard for me. I have the worst time with titles. So for the longest time, the book was, you know, the Word doc in my computer was saved as like, you know, Atlantic City novel 1, Atlantic City novel 2, Mullen novel. Like it just, you know, I avoided putting a title on it for as long as possible. And then I had to title it as a part of my thesis process. So I originally titled it Please See, like pulled that, because that's something that the women in one of the early chapters, the Jane Doe characters, that's, you know, they're imploring the rest of the world, you know, please see that we're here, please see our difficulties. And then once the book was acquired, we had a conversation, you know, with my editor and my agent about possibly changing the title. And we came up with a couple different ideas. We said we just wanted something a little stronger than Please See. So we landed on Please See Us, like a little bit more like, you know, a commanding final imperative, rather than just Please See, which was a little more open. There were a couple other titles that we considered, and it's funny now I don't remember them. I remember liking them, and, you know, I was sort of open to a lot of other options. I wasn't necessarily married to the title Please See, but when we landed on Please See Us, everyone felt that struck the right note for the book.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, not that anyone asked me, but I think it's the perfect, you know, I think encompasses like kind of what you were going for thematically so well, of just like, because so like we've already discussed so many times, these women are overlooked, you know, we all want to know about the serial killer, which like one of my questions was like, who is, like you mentioned, it's a real life case, like who is this, you know, who is this based on? And, you know, but I really do, not to beat a dead horse, but like to center the women, I think was such a powerful, and that's why I love the Jane's chapters so much. So I really think Please See Us is just, it's like a reminder, you know, every time you pick up the book that just like, no, don't forget who this story is about. Don't forget whose story this is. So kudos to you and your team.
I wish I always had a committee here to like help me with titles. That would be ideal.
I know. I kind of do the same thing as you, where sometimes I want to put it off for as long as possible because I just know I'm going to hate it or I'm going to love something and then everybody else won't like it. Or it's just like, it's so hard to get the title right, you know? But yeah. Do you already have a title in mind for your second, or are you keeping it kind of like, we'll see, we'll figure it out down the road?
Right now it's called In the Pines, which I'm like, sort of like, it just feels like a middle of the road, like what I'm calling it for now kind of title. I'm hoping to find something. I mean, I like that it evokes setting, but I think I want to look harder at title options and see what I might come up with.
Sometimes too, I think it's hard to come up with a title when the book isn't done, you know, because it's like, especially if you're not a plotter, it's like, I don't really know what this book is about until I finished it, you know? So how do I come up with like 3 or 4 words that encompasses the entire 350 pages, you know?
Right. And then someone once said something to me that I can never get out of my head at a writer's conference. He said, and he wasn't sort of knocking this method, but he's like, oh, when you pull something from the book for the title, like I did with this book, he's like, you sort of get to it as a reader in the book and you feel like you need to do like jazz hands. Like,
Yeah.
now I'm like, oh no, I've got the jazz hands title, or, you know, I just have that image in my head forever. But
Yeah.
no, titles are really tough. I envy people who I feel like there are people who really like doing titles, and you know, I will always probably have a hard time with that.
Yeah. Okay. So a number of readers, including myself, are curious about some of your literary influences. So it could be for this book specifically, or just more generally, any favorite authors, books, like people you kind of idolize. What's the background on that?
Yeah, I think for this book in particular, someone who I really admire, Elizabeth Brundage, her novel All Things Cease to Appear. It's a beautiful, like, psychological thriller, just gorgeously written, set in upstate New York. And she incorporates like a little bit of the supernatural in the book, which I think is what gave me the courage to try it in Please Yes. You know, her novel features like the appearance of ghosts, and it's very subtle, and ultimately, if I'm remembering correctly, doesn't have too much bearing on the plot, but gives it so much atmosphere. And they're just woven through the book in such a beautiful way. I worked as a bookseller when her novel, I think, came out in hardcover, and I was always recommending that one to people. And I found it really instructive for the kind of book I wanted to write. Flynn Barry was someone who I had read while I was writing Please Yes. I love her work. I think similarly to Elizabeth Brundage, she's just a really strong writer on the sentence level. She, you know, writes female characters that are complex and flawed and really interesting and sort of messy, but, you know, deeply relatable. Her descriptions are really beautiful. So I really admire her work as well. Those 2 books in particular were very instructive when I was writing and revising Please Yes.
I'm writing them down to add them to my TBR.
They're really good.
Okay, Tracy wants to know if you are a fan of true crime and if you've gotten your inspiration to write novels like this by watching or listening to any true crime podcasts, documentaries, series, things like that.
You know, what's funny? I'm not the biggest consumer of true crime, and it's like, it's weird because I'm a little bit of a scaredy cat when it comes to that kind of stuff. I think because I like do tend to like my imagination sort of gets the better of me. So maybe that's why I find that genre a little bit hard. I mean, I've read true crime classics like, you know, In Cold Blood, you know, some of the newer like true crime, you know, influenced memoirs and that kind of thing. But it's so scary. Like, I think like this is obviously inspired, as I've said, by real life events. But once I decided that, I didn't really read up on the details of the murders because I wanted the book to be its own story. I wanted that to be like the jumping off point for what I was writing, not, you know, a basis in any way. I didn't base any of my Jane Doe characters on the real life victims. I wanted it to feel like more of an invention, you know, with that spark of an idea as inspiration. But it's not like I was combing through real life details of the case. And, you know, particularly because Please Yes doesn't really have as its focus like any sort of formal investigation, like a police investigation where like, you know, I needed to look at like forensic details or that kind of thing. But I will say, and as with the new book, real life events are often like a starting point for me. And then I'll, you know, go away and try to turn it into something that feels like a fiction with, you know, different details and backstories and characters and settings. And so I like using true life stories as a jumping off point, but like true crime, you know, I don't consume a ton of true crime, although I just read really good Analysis Savage Appetites. I don't know if people have read that by Monroe. Yeah, she's like a really good exploration of like why women in particular seem really drawn to those kinds of stories. and that it's maybe more complicated than it looks on the surface. Yeah, it's a fascinating book. So like I feel like I'm reading about people's obsession with true crime, maybe a little more than like true crime itself.
Yeah, it is interesting. And, to your point about how interested women specifically are in it is quite, yeah. If anybody is curious, if the book is Savage Appetites by Rachel Monroe, it's definitely, if you're a true crime fan or just interested in why people are true crime fans, that's definitely worth taking a look at, I think. Okay, what was my next question? So Sunny asked, how did you get your start as a mystery author? And I'm going to kind of add on to that, which is like, it sounds like you didn't even necessarily go into your writing career wanting to be a thriller writer. It's just, this was a story and a topic that really drew you in, or do I have that wrong? And you've always wanted to write thrillers?
No, that's totally right. Yeah, I don't think I like consciously set out to write, mystery thriller genre books. It was more that this story sort of tugged me along with it once I started thinking about something else that I might write in lieu of the novel that I had been struggling with previously. I'd written a lot of short stories before that. In college, I wrote poetry. I try to read really widely. But of course, I also read a lot in the mystery thriller genre. I guess I always thought like, well, I couldn't be a mystery or thriller writer because I found plot so hard. I'm not someone who's naturally going to be like, I know what the twist is, or I know, I've got this like intricate plot idea in my head. That's not necessarily what makes me sit down to write. It takes me a long time to get to that place, many, many drafts. So I guess I had always sort of discounted myself as someone who maybe couldn't write a mystery or thriller. And it took this particular story and the encouragement of my thesis advisor to sort of lean into genre conventions a little more and approach it from the mystery thriller angle.
And Abina wants to know, what was the hardest scene to write in the book and why? If you
Yeah, I think there's a scene where Clara and Lily end up in a hotel room with two men, and I don't want to give too much away, but I think that was a difficult scene on two levels. Like one, it was a technically difficult scene to figure out because I'm like, okay, there's four people in a room, everyone with their own agendas and imperatives and thoughts, and so getting that down and sort of like the technicality of those descriptions and where people are and what they're doing. It's always hard when you start to get more than like two or three people in a scene, I feel like. So, which by the way, is something Stephanie does really well in her upcoming novel. But so that's hard from like a writing point of view. And I think that was also difficult from an emotional point of view because it's like an emotionally difficult and charged scene. So that it was hard in that sense too. So I think that scene sort of did double duty in both like writing wise, it was difficult, and emotionally it was difficult to write.
You pulled it off so well. I reread it yesterday. And yeah, it's just, we won't give too much away, but it's gut wrenching. So I can see, yeah, that would be a hard one to write. Okay, we only have time for a couple more questions, but Anita wonders, recently I have been seeing that authors are creating Spotify playlists. Did you create one for Please See Us?
I love that. I didn't do a Spotify playlist for Please See Us, but like sort of Jersey oriented music was like, there's appearances by like, Bruce Springsteen gets name dropped in the book. Like I'm always thinking about like the sort of summary songs, the songs about like, that mythologize the Jersey Shore and how they like both do and don't hold up in real life. So I didn't have a playlist per se, but like I was always thinking about like those kinds of songs, or the songs you would hear in a casino, or the songs you would hear, in this kind of restaurant in the Jersey Shore. So like I was thinking about music at certain points of the book for sure.
Do you write listening to music, or dead silence, or something in between? Or
generally no, like unless I'm in a public place, and I will like write at a library or a cafe from time to time, and then I might listen to like, I don't know, classical music just to sort of have something to drown out the stuff around me. But I can't listen to anything with lyrics while I'm working, or else I feel like my thoughts are just a little tangled.
Yeah, I'm the same way. Yeah, it's just it's my preferred is silence unless I need something to block out noise. Because, I think writers are master eavesdroppers. And if somebody, God forbid, somebody's having an interesting question next to you, and then it's like, now I'm just like thinking of what's the story of this instead of the world I'm supposed to be focused on.
Yeah, if someone's got like good gossip at the cafe table next, like forget this Word document. Like I want to know what's happening over here. So yeah, writers are inherently a little bit nosy that way.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I think, let me see if I can find one more. Do you have any advice for aspiring authors? That's from Kelly.
I think my advice would be, like, if you're working on whatever you're working on, a novel, a screenplay, a short story, whatever it is, it's probably going to take a little bit longer and more drafts than you think it will or that you want it to take. But you've got to trust the process. And, it doesn't mean that you're bad at writing if something takes you a long time, or if you're moving through multiple drafts, it means you are putting your work in. So I feel like that's something that came up sometimes with students, people, and this is totally an understandable impulse, would be so eager to publish and to get the validation of an agent or someone in publishing. And that makes total sense. And I've been there. I completely understand that. But you've got to sort of do your due diligence with the process first and take the story as far as you possibly can. And that just often means putting in the time and putting in a lot of work and just seeing it through draft after draft.
Even if you have to rewrite the whole thing a new time.
Even if you're a crazy person and you rewrite the whole thing.
This is the process. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. I think I speak for everyone when I say this was an awesome chat. Thank you, Caitlin, for being so forthright and joining everyone. Thank you to all the viewers and readers. You can pick up copies of Please See Us, which is the Barnes & Noble Mystery Thriller Monthly Pick for March. It's available 24/7 on barnesandnoble.com and at local Barnes & Noble stores. And I think that's all from us. So good to talk to you, Caitlin, and I'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And thank you, Stephanie.
Yep. All right. Bye, everyone.